I want to finish off the detailed view controller next. So right now we've pretty much left it as it was generated. So when we run our app and we select one of these rows, right now it's really not doing anything because we're not setting it up. So let's go into the storyboard, and the first thing I want to do is just add some different controls out here to my detail. So we'll use this as our name. So this will be our track name. And then we're also going to add an image, a larger image. So I'll go down here, grab an image view, and we'll center this guy, standard distance from the top. And I'd like to square this one out. So let's go like 180 by 180. So probably the easiest way to do that is over here in my size thingy. So we'll go 180 by 180, and then I'll center it, standard distance from the top. And I think there's gonna be some constraints already from the generated code, and I'm just gonna delete all these. I'm gonna completely change how the layout works here. So first thing I'll do is put this guy, we'll say align this guy horizontal center, and then we'll say standard distance from the top, and then we'll pin its width and height. Okay, so that takes care of that one. That's all set. That'll always show in the center right at the top, 180 by 180. Then we'll put this standard distance from there, and we'll stretch it so it's standard distance from each side. And then we've got the attribute on this guy center over here, so it'll always be centered that way. And then we can make one more of these. So we've already got that one hooked up. Let me just drag a text label out. So this will be artist name. And we'll stretch these. That, and then we'll center it, and we'll set the property on these the same. So this one's system size 14. Okay, so those are the same. And then let's add these constraints. So this one we will align horizontal center. Same with this one. Okay, then we'll put this one standard distance from there. This one standard distance from there. And then we'll pin the size on both of these to be what we've got. Okay, so those should always show up right under there. And then I want to put my two buttons in the corners. So we'll drag that in, and this will be artist. And then we'll have another button here. Track, and that's what will lead to the web content. But first let's get the detail view hooked up. So I'm going to need outlets for these. I have an outlet already for this one, that first one, but I don't like the name of that, so I'm just going to go in here and delete this. Now whenever you do this, okay, this is where you run into problems if you're not careful. So whenever you do something like this, you're always going to want to go back here, select your controller, go over here and make sure you get rid of it here, otherwise it will crash when that view shows up. Okay, so I got rid of that one, and we better, well, we'll fix that in a second. So we'll say track name. This one is track name and this one is artist name, and we'll do the same thing with our picture here. So it'll be our album image. And a lot of times we just hang actions off buttons, but I'm actually going to use this a segue with the same name, so I'm going to want to keep these buttons distinct. So I'm actually going to give these names. So I'll call this my artist button, and this will be my track button. Okay, and by default, so that hooks up the outlets. By default, you'll see that on the detail item property, mine is actually going to be an NS dictionary. I know that ahead of time because that's what I've got each album as. So I'm going to make this of that type. And we've got this did set that we're adding on here. So whenever you set this value, it's going to call configure view. And in configure view, that's when we'll actually pull the thing apart and apply it to the actual view hierarchy. So let's go ahead and write this out. So our detail, again, is a NS dictionary. And the first one we need to deal with here is the track name. Okay, so we'll do this, and then I'll say label text equals, and once again, it's not detail.description because this is an NS dictionary, so I can say object for key name, and this one, remember, was a string. So this code is kind of similar to what we did before. So that takes care of the first one, and we can copy this to do the same thing for artist name. So this would be self.artistName, and here we actually have another dictionary we need to grab, so we'll say let artist equals detail.object for key, and it's artist. Remember, this one was a dictionary. And let me just get this so we can see it bigger. So having done that, now I can ask label.text, or I can set label.text to artist unwrapped object for key name, and that's a string. Okay, that sets those. And now for image view, I need to once again do a fetch, but this time I want to use the big or a bigger image. I don't want to use that little tiny small one, so I'll be fetching a different one. So we'll do our image view now. So we'll say image view is going to be equal to self.album image, and then we can send in we'll set it up to be the default first, which we did the same way as last time, and the name of the file was last.fm logo. So there's our default, and I always end up with a capital M because I don't let go of the shift key on time. And then we can go ahead and pull apart that array again. So we'll say if let images equals detail.object for key, and what we're looking for now is the object image, and that was an NS array. And the first image, we actually want the second image now, so we're going to say if let, actually it's the third image. Third image equal images sub 2, and that is a dictionary. So if that's true, now we can try to load this guy. So we can say image view.load image from URL, and the URL here is ns_url, and it's, oops, I need to fetch one more. Sorry, I screwed up. So I need to say one more time here, if let image URL equals third image, and then it's pound text, and that's a string. So there's my URL. And then on this, I'll fix the indenting later. So ns_url's string is going to be image URL. So there's my image URL. And then the UI image here on my placeholder will be image views image, which we just set. And the caching key, once again, is the image URL. So if we indent here, and that should work. Alright, so now having set that data, it should basically pull apart that model that we gave it and stick it all up on the views. And the other thing, yeah, so we call it there. So the only thing now we need to do is we need to go back into our master view controller, and when you select a particular row, we need to make sure we take the NS dictionary for that track and stuff it as the model on this next one. So we need to revisit our master view controller, and in the prepare for segue I had just commented everything off there, and so we're going to want to revisit that guy, and the segue is the same, so I can take this line of code back in, and the way we get the data out of the row for the selected one is good, so we'll take that, and this one needs to be modified. So our object here is going to be as NS dictionary. And then this line will be the same again, as will this one and this one. Alright, so let's give it a run and see if it works. So everything loaded up, and it looks like everything's good, but I think I forgot to put constraints on those buttons, and so it appeared way off the screen, and this one's obviously not in the right place. So let's quickly go back. So I added them in the right place, I just didn't put the constraints on. So let's go here, trailing space, bottom space, trailing space, bottom space. Okay, and it's still complaining about something up here. Okay, it needs a constraint for X position. Why didn't it get that? I gave it one. Leading space. There. Yeah, I must have missed. Okay, so I think that should fix that. Alright, and so now if we go in here, now everything's lined up good. So we're golden. Now, the last thing I want to do is I want to hook up these buttons so that when you click them, they will vector off to the mobile web content of those particular items. So if it's artist, it'll load a web view in another view controller of the artist mobile web formatted page, and vice versa for track. So I need to go into my storyboard and add another view controller to do this. So we'll go in here and add this, and I'm going to have this this thing so that when you push either button, they're both going to segue to this view, and I'm going to select this button and do a show, so that'll turn into a push, and notice how it added the nav controller there. And this button will do the same thing. And then what I want to do is fill this screen with a web view. And I'm simply going to put that web content in there. So I'll go down here and find my web view. And I must have passed by it, so I just end up going web view. And we'll drag that in there. Alright, so there it is. And I'm going to add some constraints. What I want this thing to do is I want it to pin to the sides of this thing, and I want it to be fully fill the screen. So no matter what dimension the screen is, I want this web view just to stretch and grow and fill it, because remember, when that content's formatted, the HTML itself will take advantage of the size of that. So let's see if we can do this down here. No, it won't let me do it there, so let's see if I can do it this way. Okay, let's see if I can do it this way. So line there. So that was leading, editor, oops, and then you got to select it every time. That's what's annoying here. And then editor pin trailing, editor. Alright, so there it is. And now, you saw in the original demo I did this evening, you saw the actual web view and how I kind of commandeered that back button and overrode its behavior. You probably didn't notice, but I also had an activity indicator right on the web view, and I had this action share. There's quite a bit of code actually in doing all that. Instead of hand doing that, I'm just going to copy and paste that. I'm going to grab it and just drag it into the project, hook it up to this controller, and then we'll just walk through it and talk about it, and it'll save us a lot of time. So let me go back and find that code. It's in the same place here. I called it custom web view controller. I'll add it here. We'll copy it, and we'll go in here and set it. Okay, and that code is here. So it has a single property. It's got a couple properties actually. So it's got a web URL, and then there's also this web activity indicator, which is the UI. This is a spinning thing I'm going to put right on the nav bar just to show you that it can be done. And so the first thing I do before I go into this code is I should hook it up so that when we segue into this thing, we got to give it the right URL. So I need to parse the track dictionary, find that URL, and it turns out with a little bit of code splunking and reverse engineering, they don't really have a responsive site. So if you hit their website on a mobile device, they automatically redirect you to a different URL. Right? So they use a different URL naming scheme, so it's not really responsive in a true sense. It's more kind of the way people did this in a legacy way. So we need to kind of rewrite those APIs that are coming out of the JSON in order to get them to go to the mobile version of that page instead of the full screen one. So I'm going to go into my detail view controller, and in this guy's prepare for segue, which I guess we don't have at this point because we didn't override them. So let me go and add that method. So we're going to say override prepare for segue, and we're going to add our code in here. I'm going to put, first of all, put a name on the segue, just so if I extend this app later, it might screw me up. So these segues, these two segues, I want to give the same name because I'm going to have the same behavior in both of these. Well, you know, I could do it. I could just look at the button ID. So let me do that. So we'll do this easier yet. So if I just look at the sender ID, so if I say something like this, so we say if sender, and I'll typecast it to a UI button, and if it's equal to my track button, then I need to reformat, get that URL out of my model, and then I need to kind of tweak it a little bit so it works. Otherwise, if sender as UI button equals self.artist, oops, button. Okay, so here's the first logic. So I need to find the URL, and so I'm going to do that as follows. I can get the mobile URL, and it's going to come from my detail item, and that's a dictionary, remember, and I'm going to ask it for the key URL, and it turns out that that is a string. And I need to do a little bit of work on this thing, so I'm going to reset this thing. That's why I set it up as a var, so it's mutable. And I need to say that this thing is going to equal so I can say string by replacing occurrences of string. And the target here will be this, www.lastfm. And if I replace that with the pattern m.lastfm, that will do what I want to do. And I don't really care about these other guys. Okay, so that is the only thing I'm doing. I'm replacing the www with a m, and it'll actually go to the right version of the page. And that's something I just found by tinkering around with their website. Now I need to set this URL on that web view controller. So remember we had that property web URL. So I can do that by saying segue.destination view controller. So that's where we're going, and that's that custom web view controller. So I want to cast it as such. So I'm going to say that's a custom web view controller. And then I'm just going to set its web URL property to my mobile URL. And then I also want to set the title on that screen to either be track or artist, depending on what screen I'm on. So I can do that in a very similar way. So I'll take that destination view controller, cast it, as a custom web view controller, and then I can simply say title equals, this was track, because it was the track button. And for this, I'm going to do something very similar. The only thing I'm going to do different here is this piece. It's going to be slightly different, so we're going to say var mobile URL is equal to artist. I'm sorry. Got to get the artist object first, and it's a dictionary. So I'll say artist equals self detail item object for key artist as ns dictionary, and then once I got that, I can say artist object for key, and we want the URL as a string. And the other thing we want to do is make sure that this says artists. Okay, so that hooks up the destination view controller, so when you click on those buttons on the bottom, it sets the appropriate URL on the web view controller. Let's look at the rest of the code in our custom web view controller. So in view.did_load, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a UR_bar button item. So I don't just put a little spinning thing up on the bar. It's a little bit bigger, it's right in your face, so you can actually see that this web view is actually actively loading a page right now. And so I'm going to use this to create it. And I also am going to create a view in Safari. There's going to be a little, we call it the action bar item. And it's that little box with an up arrow pointing out of it. And it typically means share or do something with this content. That's why its type is action. And so that's a built-in style here. So I can simply ask for UR_bar button system item action. That'll give me that particular box. And there's a good half a dozen to a dozen of these standard actions. That plus one that we saw last time for adding something. There's a camera one for doing a camera and so forth. And what I want to do when you push that button, that action button, is I want you to call a method defined by this class, so self, called view in Safari. What I want to do is pop the Safari browser so that it automatically runs Safari and loads this URL. So if you want to view this content in Safari so you can bookmark it and read it later or whatever, that's what this button's for. Very common feature. And I add these up to the right on my nav bar by taking them and putting them in an array and assigning the property right bar button items. So that's what I do when I load. I put those two additional items, the activity indicator first, and then in the far right you'll see that, I'm sorry, just the, yeah, no, that's right. And then you'll see the action one. Then when the view loads, we take a look at the URL. We create an NSURL of it. Remember, that's kind of the iOS wrapped version of that string. And then we create an NS mutable URL request, which we can simply pass to the web view. So there's the web view that we set up as an outlet, and it's got a method called load request, and we can give it an NS mutable request, which simply has the URL and some other stuff. So we're setting this policy. We can look at that later, and we're setting a timeout of 10 seconds on it. So if it takes more than 10 seconds, it'll actually call an error callback on the delegate method telling us, hey, it timed out. And the method on the get, or the method on the load, is going to be get, and the delegate is self. Okay, so this web view has a delegate protocol. And as the load of content in its web view is happening, it will call these delegate functions. So if you look at my class definition, you'll see that my custom web view controller inherits from UI web view controller, but I put a comma and there's a protocol. So UI web view delegate is a delegate that as a web view is loading and interacting with content, it will call methods back. So our controller is going to kind of keep tabs on this thing when it starts loading, when it finishes loading, and if it errors out or has a problem. And those methods I've implemented down here. So there are 3 of them. So here's my WebView delegate protocol methods. So when you start loading, I get called. And so when you start loading, I simply start up the indicator. Okay, so that's what gets that thing spinning. We'll look at that code. Well, that's a built-in method, so it just says start animating. It starts spinning that activity indicator. And then I've got a method I wrote, which we'll look at in a moment, that says update back button. So whenever we're loading content or backing off on content in our web view, I want to run some code I wrote that updates that back button. So if I've got context, if I got stuff stacked up because you've drilled down into links, then I'm always going to put the word back up there. And when you push it, I'm going to interpret that as pop on my web browser context. And if there is no content or no context on that web view, it's going to be the default back button, okay, which means go back to the previous view, which was my detail view controller. So we'll look at that code in a second. So those are my delegates, and if there's an error, right now I simply stop the indicator because it's not loading anymore, it got an error, and I print something out to the console right now. So you might want to pop up a dialog message or something here saying, you know, couldn't load that, retry, you know, that kind of stuff. But I just printed something out for now. And so the Safari, view in Safari function is right here. So one of your requirements in your project was to, there were multiple ones, but under the app integration, one of them was use a URL scheme to interface with another app on the device, or have your app implement an URL scheme that other apps can invoke your app. So here's an example of me leveraging that Safari, that mobile Safari app that's on an iOS device. So I'm going to cause that thing to pop up on the screen, and I'm going to tell it what content I want it to load when it starts. And we can do that by simply creating the URL, which is the URL that we're on, and then I can, on my shared application, if I just say open URL and give it that URL, the platform knows that anything with http:// anything with that http: protocol in the URL is going to automatically go to Safari. So your app can create custom URL schemes, and when people call this method with your URL, your custom URL, it's going to end up running your app. Okay. So this is kind of an example of if you're framing somebody else's content, web content, and you want to be able to open that up in Safari, here's an example of using an URL scheme to get another app on the device to pop. Alright, so on my activity indicator, oh, let's see, there's one other thing. So we're loading, those delegate functions get called. Whenever this view did appear, so if I start loading, and let's say it's a slow network and it's still loading from my view did load, but it hasn't finished loading yet, and somebody hits the back button, goes back to the detail page, I'm automatically just going to stop that web view from loading, and that will call my delegate method, which will turn off the activity indicator as well. Okay, so I'm just like, if the view is not up on the screen, don't bother trying to load whatever I told you to load anymore. So this web activity indicator simply treats this thing like a singleton. So it says, if you don't already have a web activity indicator in here, create one. Use the standard style gray, and when it's not moving, make it invisible. So there's a property on that guy called hides when stopped. And if you set that to true, whenever it's not moving, it automatically disappears. So if I'm not loading something, you won't see it at all. If I'm loading something, you'll see it it'll be a gray spinner, and it'll sit there spinning on my bar. All right, now this update back button was something we talked about, and let me get rid of the Objective-C code that I translated this out of. All right, so this guy here gets called, remember, from those delegate functions whenever we change the state of that web component. So I can ask my web view, can you go back? That's the equivalent of saying, is the back button active? Do you got something to go back to? In other words, do you have a stack of pages where the users click link, click link, click link? So if I have more than one click, this function is going to return a true, because that I can back to the previous page, right? So if I can go back, then I go and I check. I say, if my navigation item left bar item is nil, then I'm going to hide this back button. So in other words, if I haven't set this, that means I'm in the default configuration with that standard back button that got put on there by Nav Controller. And so I'm going to create a new back button if that's the case. So this means they clicked on something and it loaded, and when that finished loading, I'm going to call this thing, and I'm going to find out this is true. And this basically says replace that standard back button that got put on there by the Nav Controller. Make that one invisible and put up there this guy that I'm creating. And so I'm going to create a plain styled back button. It's just going to be the word back. And the target, in other words, the class method I want you to call when the user presses that is this method called backpress, defined by my current class, self. Right? And then I set that on my nav item, I set my left bar button to be that button. So I'm kind of hiding the default one and I'm putting up this custom one. And when you press that back button, the code for that is right above it here. And I simply say, hey, if you can go back, then go back. Okay, so it's basically going to pop the web view back to the previous view. So I'm hooking the action on my back button, my web browser here. Now, if this wasn't true, so if I can't go back, in other words, I'm at the top of my web views stack on the very first page I started at, then I want you to go turn that left bar button off and then take my nav item and put that back button back on by setting hides back button to false. And that restores the original back button that was up there. All right, so that's what gives me that behavior. When I drill into content, it changes that to a back button. Once that content's gone, it puts it back to the nav controller back button, which puts me in the detail view. That's pretty much it. Okay, so there's kind of quite a few bits and pieces in that. Let's go ahead and run it and make sure it's all working. So there's some content. We'll go over to the track view. Oops. And the web view, I never hooked up an outlet for it. All right, so we need to hook up a web outlet on that web view. So we'll go here to our assistant editor. I do got an outlet. It's just not hung up. It's not. Okay, I added this code and I never hung it. Okay, so that should do it. So I kind of cut-paste the code and I forgot to go back in and wire up the outlet. So now if we do that, okay. Oh, I stretched this out. I did this wrong as well, so we'll have to fix that. And for some reason that's not finishing. Okay, so let's fix this up. So I want to get rid of this constraint. Oh boy. Let's go like that, and then when it tells me this, I'll say, what's it saying? It's saying actual Y is 0, height 600, update constraint. Okay, that should have taken care of that. And let's just see if that works. Okay, so that works, and if we rotate, notice how it's filling the screen. My web view is resizing. And for some reason my stop is not working, but here's my Safari. Okay, so notice it pops Safari there. And if I click a link, okay, it loads that, and notice it changed that. So if I back off there, and if we do a couple of them, okay, now I got 2 on my stack. And there's the artist view. Okay, this guy keeps going, so what did we do wrong with that? Let's take a look.
I think stopping it when on the completion is missing. Yeah, I think.
Did I forget to put that in there? So where's my custom web view? So on completion, yeah, okay, so we need to say stop animating. Auto completion sometimes works against you. Alright, so now we go here and it works.